Okay. So that would be in lieu of the traditional format where I would answer one of your questions, okay? Okay. So I won't say the person is or the organization, so I'll sort of like ad lib a little bit, okay? Dear Mr. Such and Such, I have recently signed up to receive communications from your organization because I would like to learn more about what you do. In one of your most recent emails, I have noted several things you said, including this quote: Together, on voting rights and all of our civil liberties, we will continue to challenge unconstitutional policies. We will keep advocating and delivering hundreds of thousands of calls and messages to Congress. And if our elected officials still have the gall to ignore the will of the people, we will make our elections a referendum on where the country is headed. End quote. I am all over the part about civil liberties and challenging unconstitutional policies. In my view, these policies go a lot deeper than just voting rights irregularities. Recently, I wrote a book, a copy of which I sent to President Biden, Vice President Harris, Madam Secretary Nancy Pelosi, and others, called They Were Not Slaves: A Demand for Reparations and Damages from the United States and the British Empire. Since the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis last year, I have come to realize that a lot of unconstitutional policies have led the country to where it is today with regard to policing and other issues. In my view, the government must be pressured to go back and sort out these issues in order that, going forward, the interrelations between members of the African American community and others in society, such as the police, can be ameliorated. It is my view that not only was it unlawful and unconstitutional for the government to have aided and abetted private actors with extrajudicially labeling millions of undefended civilians slaves and enslaving them, entre parentheses, in brackets, that is, withholding 100% of their wages for their entire working lives for a combined duration of 244 years, even though not one of these individuals had done anything wrong, close brackets. But it is also unconstitutional and unlawful for the government to have refused for over 2 centuries to pay damages and reparations to the aggrieved, to retroactively recognize and reinstate their human rights, their civil rights and labor rights, and to denounce the notion that these human beings had ever been lawfully owned by other human beings. The UN Law Commission clearly states that when states commit unlawful acts that harm civilians, they are obliged to pay reparations. Paying reparations for the unlawful taking of the bodies, labor, and being of these millions of civilians who comprised the biggest workforce in history is not a matter of philanthropy or endless congressional studies. It is a matter of law, both national law and international law. Admittedly, the United States and Britain are two of the most powerful countries in the world and can label themselves as democracies, where rule of law and not rule by law prevails, but no one can enforce anything they actually do, and so they can do whatever they want without consequence, especially when it comes to the rights of people who were never acknowledged as even having the right to have rights. Speaking of gall, as you did in your email, where these millions of civilians and their disinherited heirs are concerned, the governments have made it clear that they bear no responsibility or accountability for the violations of the human rights, civil rights, and labor rights of these undefended civilians, as well as for the wage theft and inheritance theft that has left their families economically injured over a century later. And it does not appear that they even feel apologetic about the whole thing. They could care less. It is neither right nor just. It is not justice. It is not respecting human rights. It is not respecting civil liberties. It is not rule of law. It certainly is not democracy. Why has legal counsel never been appointed for these civilians in the last 400 years? We are now 150 years post-emancipation, and the heirs and descendants of these civilian workers are still economically handicapped disproportionately as compared to the rest of society because of the economic blitzkrieg or Krieg that has been unlawfully waged against them with this wage theft and inheritance theft that has been condoned, controlled, and authorized by the governments of England and the United States. The governments know that this blitzkrieg continues to impact living descendants and that the fault lies with the government's actions and inactions that has now lasted for centuries. But the governments have reserved a disparate type of justice for people in this group, to wit, the completely different responses in several other reparations models, including the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, where French civilians were paid by Germany, the post-World War II reparations paid by Germany to the Jews, the reparations paid to the Japanese people in the United States, and the reparations paid to the slavers after the workers were finally set free from the unlawful bondage in the UK and US in 1833 and 1865, respectively. Instead of volunteering to do the right thing and restituting the living descendants of these wrongfully enslaved workers who had done nothing wrong, the governments have taken the position that, quote, too much time has passed, end quote, and that, quote, nobody alive had anything to do with it, end quote. Neither time nor statutes of limitations should apply in a case where the aggrieved has never been acknowledged as having any rights, even the right to call themselves human beings. Thus, the estates of these workers and their descendants cannot be accused of, quote, sleeping on their rights, nor can it be said that any rights have accrued or vested, since these millions of civilians were unconstitutionally deprived of all their rights, including their speech rights, property rights, labor rights, and human rights. When you consider how much the government dropped in Afghanistan to fight for human rights, it is all just a little bit confusing, because clearly the government cares about human rights and is willing to fly across the world and spend $2.6 trillion on the cause. But when it comes to the human rights and inheritance rights of these workers and their offspring, workers who have contributed so much to these countries, even without a word of thanks, the governments have taken a, quote, talk to the hand position. This is bewildering. What, if anything, can your organization do in a case such as this to help to pressure the governments to set up an administrative trust to compensate/restitute the descendants of these millions of workers who never received even a symbolic dollar of pay for their lifetime of work for a combined 244 years, even though not one of them had been adjudicated as having done anything wrong before 100% of their wages were withheld by their de facto employers with the apparent and statutory authority of the government and monarchy. Thanking you in advance for your attention. Hey. What do you think?